Recording. Stream. Good morning. We're live. Welcome into Sunday School with Murph. I am Murph, obviously, and just that a little bit. All right. Happy Sunday. Happy Veterans Day to all those who put on a uniform to protect and defend liberty and freedom in America and abroad. Thank you so much to my brothers and sisters out there that raised their hand and took an oath. Hope you were able to have a blessed day, hopefully a restful weekend. My whole family is exhausted. We made it to the first round of the playoffs and the last round for us Friday night, and then it rained on us in the second half. So it made for a really fun Friday night down in Montgomery, but good job to all the football players, coaches, and of course all the band kids, everybody that worked hard for the season, and really, I honestly went out on a good note. I mean, I know we lost first round of the playoffs, but we made it there, and then we were the second team to score on this team that we played through the whole season. So really good team. It was really tough. But the kids got out there and gave it their all, and not a bad way to end the season. Obviously not the best way, but not bad. So we are in Thanksgiving mode, hopefully. In the month of November, we should be giving thanks every day. But this is, hopefully you haven't jumped the gun, skipped the thankful part, and went straight for the gimme gift giving stuff. Which, I mean, you can celebrate the birth of Christ all year long, but it's really the resurrection of Christ that's more important than anything. But hopefully you're enjoying a season of Thanksgiving as opposed to a season of gimme. So that being said, we're going to get into, pardon me here. I've been talking about this for a while, so we're finally going to do this. We're going to put this salvation, the typology stuff on hold. We will get into more of that once we get into the book of Hebrews when we're done with this study. But the Didache, so this thing here, the Didache, it's the way you actually pronounce it in Greek. Most of us probably say Didache, but Didache is the way this guy says you're supposed to pronounce it. So, what is this? And that's a good question. And interestingly enough, I only heard about it through people who have a Catholic background. I've never heard of this anywhere within Baptist faith or any other Protestant source. But people are familiar with it and it's been out there for quite some time. But this is, according to the back cover of the book here, the Didache was a first century manual of sorts for the Christian church. It was contemporary with the book of Revelation, which was believed to be authored around 60 AD, and purports to have been written by the 12 original apostles of Jesus Christ, Gentile Christian churches, as a quick tutorial of instruction for conduct and practice. The back cover goes on to say the document is strongly Jewish in flavor, providing a fascinating link to the Jewish origins of the Christian faith, particularly that of the Essenes, as the first section is directly taken from the Essene work, The Two Ways, which was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. For centuries, document was considered to be lost until 1873, when an Eastern Orthodox monk found a copy in the original Greek dated to 1056 in a monastery in Istanbul. This edition, originally released in ebook format in 2017, is the first contemporary English translation that seeks to balance the literal rendering of the text with the contextual thought of the author's time period, breathing life into the ancient wisdom that birthed the worldwide Christian church for us to consider in our own time and context. So, I found this on Amazon now. Somebody, like I said, was in a group chat with some guys that I knew down in Florida, and one of them was Catholic, started talking about this. So I went to Amazon looking for it to find a copy. And you're going to find multiple copies of stuff, but don't confuse this with this. Now, clearly they look different. The covers are totally different. But this right here is not the same as this. This, the guy named Dr. Timothy Kernan, I guess, was trying to start something called the sold out movement. I'm not really familiar with that. I noticed in looking through this to compare the two, this doesn't even match up with this. There is lots of scripture links and biblical reference in here. The biggest thing I saw different was that this guy does not believe in an actual rapture as we believe. Despite saying that's what the word rapture means, it doesn't really mean what it says it means, kind of a thing, which is a red flag for me. As a whole, I'd have to do a lot more deeper study to see if this is even, I've seen, there's some interesting stuff in here. It does get into doctrine and teaching, and that's his whole thing, because Didache means teaching. And of course, doctrine is a synonymous word. Doctrine also means teaching. But it is not taken from the original Greek scroll, manuscript, whatever, that this was taken from. So this is what we're looking into, not this. If you're looking on Amazon, this is, if you want to get into this, that's fine. There's like 3 books. He's got 3 books that have Greek names on them, and you can find them. I'm not going to do that. So I'm not going to worry about this. Just this, because this is actually taken from the original Greek scroll, original Greek stuff. And so what you have to kind of shorten up how he said it on the back cover of this, essentially this is like the first commentary, so to speak. This is the first evidence of a commentary. It's a summation of the New Testament. It's a summation of the teachings of Christ and then how to apply them. So if you had a group of Gentiles that really knew nothing about Judaism, then this would be a great thing for them. Now, as to whether or not it actually came from the 12 apostles, this was considered for a period of time for canonization, as far as like how the epistles were canonized, and what you had to be able to do in order for canonization in those early days was to prove that there was not only godly inspiration but connection to an apostle. So you had to be an apostle yourself writing it, or you had to be the disciple of an apostle, and you had to be able to prove it without a doubt. That's one of the key things for canonizing the epistles and the Gospels as well, is being able to actually connect it directly to an apostle. Aside from the fact that it has to also line up biblically, it has to line up with the Old Testament, it has to line up with prophecy. So it's not just, hey, let's just throw a bunch of junk together that's written in Greek and say this is the Bible. There's a lot that goes into figuring that out. But ultimately, this was rejected for canonization. It doesn't mean it has no value, but again, it's not the Bible. It's not meant to replace the Bible. And what I really like about what this guy, this Douglas J. Michalak, 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 is he actually finds scriptural reference that lines up with what each thing says in here. And what you have is essentially 16 bullet points, 16 pages. He refers to them as chapters. Some are very short. They're one paragraph, two paragraphs. And of course, you got to understand and remember that Greeks didn't write like that. Neither did the Hebrews. They wrote long form, continuous thought kind of stuff. They didn't have punctuation. They didn't have paragraphs like we do. I mean, I'm sure there was probably gaps where one writing stopped and the next began, but oftentimes we have a hard time finding those kind of things in the original when we're translating these ancient scrolls, that are anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 years old. And like I said, they found a copy in 1050 that was dated to 1056 in a monastery in Istanbul. So we'll get into this. He gets into, he does 17 chapters as you read through this. And then he has, on page 17 here, is commentary of it. So he gives you all the stuff that was contained in the Didache, and then he gives this commentary on it. Let's see here. Okay, so one of the things that happened during the first century, and we see the beginnings of it with the Judaizers that Paul was warning about. And those are the people that were Jews that were coming into Christian congregations and saying, you can't be a good Christian unless you do Jewish things. And we have people doing that today. Hebrew roots movements, parts of the Messianic Jewish movement. There's people out there that want to sit there and say that you have to do the Old Testament law, and that's just not the case. All right, so what you had was the fight against that, and taken to an extreme, what ends up developing is actually an anti-Jewish sentiment, an anti-Jewish mindset, because we're Christians, we're Jews, we're not Jews, we're Gentiles, more specifically, because they were first century Christians were Jews that accepted their Messiah. They didn't convert to Christianity. Matter of fact, the term Christian was actually a slur that was given by Jews against those who were accepting the Messiah. And of course, Christ is a Greek term. It's not a Hebrew term. In Hebrew, he's the Messiah. In Greek, he's the anointed one. He is the Christ. And so that's their term for Messiah. But, so the Jews going after the people who were choosing to follow Christ, calling them Christians as kind of a slur. And of course, we've taken that and run with it. And we're more than happy to be followers of the anointed one who died for our sins, right? So you actually see that build, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Jewish sentiment that builds, ultimately culminating in the beginnings of the Roman Catholic Church in 300, when you bring along Constantine. So by then you've got these fightings because people are trying to resist the Judaizers. And but what this does, in reading through this, is it actually finds the middle ground between Judaism and Christianity. It is the teachings of Christ and linking it back to the old. It's like I said, it kind of summarizes, and there's parts where they heavily reference the Sermon on the Mount, where Christ actually took the law and kind of explained it better. He gave his commentary on it so people could better understand. The Jews had come up with all kinds of rules and regulations, especially like on the Sabbath, right? You could only travel a stone's throw, and you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that, and it was what the Jews made the Sabbath was more work than it needed to be, right? And Christ came along and he's like, it's not supposed to be like that. So this is it's a blending of things. And again, this guy here, this Douglas J. Michalak, has scripture references to the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And so this really, it would have been like the first Sunday school material. You're going to start a church in the first, second century. Somebody got you a copy of this and you had a place to start from. Not everybody had access to the scrolls. Not everybody could afford the papyrus or the whatever material. Maybe they could afford the material, they couldn't afford the ink. Ink was expensive back then. So to have something like this, that would have been a lot less writing, it would have been shorter, it would have been a good place to start. So, let's see here. He starts it out with, there's a, where did it go? The beginning of this, it's, let's see here, page 4, once you get past the, it starts out, the first 6 chapters called the 2 ways, the way of life and the way of death. And so, let's see here. There are 2 ways, one of life, one of death, but there's a great difference between them. This is the way of life. First, you shall love God who made you. Second, love your neighbor as yourself. And do not do to another what you would not want done to you. From these sayings come these teachings. Bless those who curse you. Pray for your enemies and fast for those who persecute you. What reward is there for loving those who love you? Is that not what the Gentiles do? Instead, love those who hate you, and you will not have an enemy. So, of course, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 17 through 18. Matthew, Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 22. Mark chapter 12, Luke chapter 10. The golden rule, as you heard in there, comes out of Matthew chapter 7. Also shows up in Luke chapter 6, 31, verse 31 there. So, again, it's plenty of scripture to back things up. So this is, let's see here. Let's see here. It would be verse 4. Abstain from fleshly and worldly lusts. If someone hits your right cheek, turn him the other also, and you shall be truly holy. If someone forces you to go with them for 1 mile, go with him 2 voluntarily. If someone takes your cloak, give him your coat 2. If someone steals what is yours, let it go. You cannot get it back anyway. So, I mean, if you're hearing, I mean, this is very similar to Sermon on the Mount. These are Christ's teachings. If you've read through the Gospels, you're hearing Christ say these things, even though this is somebody else interpreting it. It would be like a really good sermon. Let's see here. So the way of life and the way of death, 2 ways. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 through 20. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice and hold fast to him, for the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, of course, that's the book of Deuteronomy. That's speaking directly to the Jews. You and I don't have to go in and take possession of the promised land. The promised land for us is not here on earth. It is in heaven with God. But that's where this the two ways comes from in these first 6 chapters. And one of the things, if you study Old Testament law, what you realize is that their dietary laws, their rituals, all the stuff that God told them to do was to separate them from the pagans, to separate them from the Gentiles. The intent being they would be an example for the rest of the world. Like if you heard where it says in the Bible that nobody lights their candle and places it under a basket. Well, that's what the Jews ended up doing, is they hoarded, so to speak, the word and the teachings of God and kept it to themselves, didn't share with anybody else. And so other nations were pagan and stayed pagan, and Jews actually got to be really upset when God started saving pagans and doing things to help Gentiles. We kind of got into that with the salvation typology. Christ went to the Jews, they rejected him, and then he took salvation to the Gentiles, right? And you see that in places in the Old Testament. Short term. Christ did long term. David and Moses and Abraham and all these guys did short term stuff. But it's your first century Christians were Jews, as I said, so they would totally understand, and they're trying to reconcile the law with the coming of the Messiah. And then, are we under the law? Are we beholden to it still? Do we have to still keep with the eating restrictions, all that, which a lot of that is explained in the epistles. But again, not everybody's going to have access to all of that. Like I said, ink was expensive, so was papyrus. And, so this is not encouraging you to be a Jew, but it's speaking to Jews and then giving context for Gentiles who would become Christians, who would follow the Messiah. And so the Gentiles would need context as to where all this stuff is coming from without having to go back and learn the Torah, as people are trying to tell us today, or as the Judaizers were trying to tell them back then. Let's see here, part 2. In the second part of this teaching, you shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not commit pedophilia, you shall not have sexual relations outside of marriage, you shall not steal, you shall not practice magic, you shall not practice witchcraft, you shall not murder a child by abortion or kill a newborn, you shall not covet your neighbor's possessions, you shall not swear, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not speak evil nor bear a grudge. Pardon me. So, it was specifically forbidden for Jews. It was in their law that they could not, and obviously they didn't have the term abortion back then, and they didn't have so-called barbaric medical procedures like we do today, but they would take a woman if they didn't want her to have the child, and they would beat the woman to kill the child. If the child was born and the child had a deformity, they would drown them. There's a number of things they would do to deal with an unwanted child in some form or fashion. It's pretty disgusting. And what you'll actually see in history, you go through Josephus and some of these other first, second century historians, and like one of the Greek traditions, if you had an unwanted child, they'd set him out there to die overnight in the elements, in the cold. They'd set the child outside their front doorstep. And so what ended up happening was the first century and second century Christians would actually come along at night and take these children and save them. And so, Christian fostering and orphanages and adoption was actually a very common thing from the very beginning, because all life is sacred to God, and so they would go along and save these children, and which was very much keeping in line with the law of Moses and Jewish law, even though the Jews were not necessarily doing that. They wouldn't do that to their own kids, but they didn't worry about the Greek kids or anything like that, generally speaking. So they would have very much understood this. And like I said, a lot of this stuff is coming out of the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Luke chapter 6, Matthew chapter 5. Let's see. You should not be double-minded nor double-tongued, for to be double-tongued is a snare of death. You shall not repeat falsehood nor make empty promises, but your speech must be backed by action. 1 Kings 18, Psalm 12, 119, Isaiah 29, 1 Timothy, James, Psalm 12 again. So again, all this stuff, all these teachings are totally biblical, right in line with what Christ would have taught. Again, as a basic thing, we don't need to make this more complicated than it has to be. And we don't need to sit there and put a bunch of ritualistic stuff in the middle of it. We don't need to sit there and it's like, you can't get to heaven unless you know unless you're a 5-point Calvinist, right? Well, did the guy on the thief on the cross next to Christ, when Christ promised him he's getting to heaven, was he able to learn the Calvinism? Was he able to learn exactly what this verse meant? Or no, he couldn't. He didn't. And we need to keep it simple. Do we need to learn our doctrine? Yes, Glenn, that's what this is all about, is learn the teachings of Christ, the true intent that God had with his laws, and how they were about connecting with him, reconnecting with him, and actually caring for other people just as he cared. So when you go through this stuff, when you go through commentaries, when you go through any kind of thing out there that is trying to explain the Bible, if they're adding a bunch of junk to it, stay away from it. Get rid of it. I mean, really, it's my father used to say, keep it simple. Well, I won't call you stupid, but keep it simple, silly. The KISS method. We don't need to overcomplicate the gospel, and we don't need to overcomplicate church. We need to, as Christ said, there's a perfect and undefiled religion, and that's to look after widows and orphans. In other words, people that can't look out for themselves. And the way of life versus the way of death. The two ways that he's covered here in these first 6 chapters, so to speak. And we will get into next week, there's instructions for rituals. And then after that, you got a section about apostles, prophets, and teachers. And there's actually, chapter 14 deals with the Sabbath. Chapter 15, bishops and deacons. Chapter 16 gets into the last days. So this will be interesting. I guess 3 Sundays, I suppose. Maybe a 4th, but for sure 3. So next week we'll pick up on chapter 7. Maybe we'll cover chapter 5 and 6 real quick, and then we'll get into the instructions for rituals in chapter 7, which includes baptism. So we'll get a better understanding of that and what all that entails. So, like I said, go to Amazon's where I found this. You probably can find it at a Christian bookstore. Again, you want this one, not this one. I don't know what this guy's pushing or selling, but I'm not buying it. So pick you up a copy of this. It's just commentary to kind of give a better context to what all was going on in that first century. and maybe see, are we doing things similar or better or worse than they were doing in the first century? Are we doing it now? So, like, are we going out and making disciples by sharing the Didache with them? So, I will see you guys next time. God bless. Get some rest and make disciples.